Hey, everybody. Before we start today's interview, I want to tell you about the release of my new book. It is called Country Boy, The Roots of Johnny Cash. It is going to be available in paperback from the University of Arkansas Press on July 29. At least that is the date that I see on Amazon, and I haven't been told any differently. So if you are interested in this book, you can pick it up. It's available for pre-order now on Amazon. It is going for $24.95. If you are a Prime member, you get free shipping, and there will also be an audiobook coming out. I'm not sure exactly when or how much that is going to cost, but that will be available. So if you want to wait for the audiobook, that is fine. But if you're interested in the paperback, it is available for pre-order now on Amazon. You can also check out my other book, Marching Masters, Slavery, Race, and the Confederate Army During the Civil War. That is available on Kindle for $29.95. You can get that on Amazon too, or Barnes & Noble, or other online retailers. I think there still are some. And you can get the hardcover for $39.95. You can also contact me for a $35 signed copy if you are interested. Check me out on Twitter at Colin E. Woodward. All right, let's get to the show. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another edition of American Rambler. I'm your host, Colin Woodward. Thank you for listening to the podcast. On today's show, I have Dr. Ruth A. Hawkins. Ruth is originally from Missouri, but she has lived in Arkansas for a long time. She's up there in the Jonesboro area, and for about 30 years, she was head of the Arkansas State University Heritage Sites, a very interesting project that has taken on a number of historic properties and historic preservation projects in Arkansas, projects along the Delta, including the Johnny Cash House and Dais, the Pfeiffer-Hemingway House in Piggott, also Lakeport Plantation, which is in southeastern Arkansas, kind of close to the Louisiana border. When I was in Arkansas, I made a point to visit some of these properties. Lakeport was the first, but also went to the Johnny Cash House a couple times, once before it was open, but pretty much restored, hadn't been open to the public yet, and went back a couple times after that. Lakeport is in the middle of cotton fields, so if you go in the summer or early fall, you will see the cotton there. It is the only antebellum plantation on the Mississippi in Arkansas. So it is unique just for that reason, but the restoration is beautiful. The house looks great, as does the Cash House. I haven't been up to Piggott to see the Pfeiffer-Hemingway House, but hopefully someday I will do that. That one wasn't in nearly as rough a shape as the Cash House, which is a story and a podcast on its own. But I've known Ruth for a while. We worked together on some things in Dais. I put together a exhibit when I was in Little Rock, and the exhibit panels eventually went up to Dais. So last time I was there to give a talk, the panels were in the theater, in the old movie theater. Well, it's it's a restored movie theater. They pretty much built that back up from nothing, but is now a place where you can see exhibits and also attend lectures. I gave a lecture there back in 2017, which was the inaugural Johnny Cash Festival, which was pretty cool, and have not been back to Arkansas since. So it's been 5 years, but I've stayed in touch with Ruth. She was very helpful in writing my book. I just ordered her book in paperback. It is called Unbelievable Happiness and Final Sorrow, the Hemingway-Pfeiffer Marriage. That came out in 2012. Obviously, Ruth is an authority on the Pfeiffer-Hemingway House, but she got deep into their marriage and that whole story, which was depicted in the Ken Burns documentary on Hemingway, which I liked quite a bit, and apparently Ruth did too. So I'm looking forward to reading that. I've never read a book about, I know this isn't necessarily about Hemingway, but I haven't actually read a book about him. I've read some of his novels, and he was an interesting guy, to say the least, and complicated, to put it diplomatically, and was married a number of times. So I look forward to reading about their marriage. And Ruth was very helpful with my manuscript on Johnny Cash, the last chapter, which deals with the restoration of the Johnny Cash Boyhood Home. I had researched a lot and written about, but it was good to have her look that over and get the details right. Certainly the financial aspects of restoration, I wanted to get accurate. So Ruth has been very helpful to me. She did a blurb for my book, and I kind of wanted to repay the compliment a little bit by having her on, talk about her life and career, and I just ordered her book. So it's good to stay in touch with these people, and it's nice that I've stayed in touch with some Arkansas folks over the years. Just had Guy Lancaster on and had Ruth on just this last week. And I got to say, when it comes to my writing, the best editors I have worked with have been from Arkansas. Whether it's been academics helping me, but certainly Guy Lancaster at the Encyclopedia Arkansas, David Scott Cunningham at University of Arkansas Press is great. Also want to give a shout out to Patrick Williams at the Arkansas Historical Quarterly, who was very patient and forgiving with an article I wrote on Johnny Cash a couple of years ago. All too often, editors in academia kind of all or nothing. And, they say, well, we'll send it out to peer reviewers and whatever they say goes. But Patrick was very helpful, hands-on, changed some things, I think, on his own and kind of helped it along without saying, well, you figure it all out. And that was kind of nice. And maybe that's sort of more of an old school approach. I don't know. But it was a very personal experience that I had in writing for the Arkansas Historical Quarterly. And I did know him a little bit when I was in Arkansas, but that's one of the benefits of Arkansas too, in the sense of it does kind of feel like a small town, and people might be willing to help you more than they would in another state. And certainly other publications are a lot more impersonal. So I've had a good experience with Arkansas folks with my scholarship. And so, that's why I wanted to stick it out with Johnny Cash. It was a fun book to write, but I've also had a lot of help along the way. So want to give a shout out to everybody, Ruth included. All right. Well, it is a rainy Saturday and I'm getting over a cold, so I won't say any more, but here it is, my talk with Ruth. Thanks for talking with me today. How are you doing? Are you out in Jonesboro or thereabouts?
Yes, I'm still in Jonesboro, still keeping busy, still doing a lot of what I was doing before I retired. I'm just not getting paid for it.
Oh, good. Yeah, you retired in 2019? Is that
Right,
right? Okay.
right.
Well, I guess if you're still busy, that's one thing, but also seems, looking back now over a couple of years, good time to retire in
It
terms
really was. It was a perfect time to retire.
of
I
COVID
think,
headaches and
yeah,
whatnot.
I
Yeah.
think COVID hit like 6 months after I retired. So I didn't have to deal with any of those issues.
Yeah. And you were at ASU for a long time, right? When did you get there?
I came in 78, so I was there 41 years.
Yeah. And ASU was still pretty new at the time, like 10 years old.
ASU? No, ASU is quite old, as a matter
Oh,
of
I'm
fact.
sorry. I'm sorry.
Well, ASU was founded in 1909.
Okay.
The Heritage Sites program I established about 20 years after I got there.
Okay. All right. Um, and kind of, obviously you're a historian, but what is your background? You grew up in Arkansas?
No, I actually grew up on a farm in Florissant, Missouri, which is in North St. Louis County. I was the second of 12 children and the oldest girl. So I obviously learned the value of hard work at a very young age. But I went from there to the University of Missouri. Well, actually, I went to Christian College, which is a 2-year girls' college in the same town as the University of Missouri. And
Okay.
then I transferred to the University of Missouri where I got a journalism degree. And my husband and I married. He was from the Boot Heel of Missouri, which is just across the Arkansas line. And we went to Virginia. He was in the Navy, and so he was sent to Virginia, and we stayed in Virginia for 10 years where I was first a television reporter and then a newspaper reporter and then a public relations director. And then we decided to move to Arkansas so that my husband could go into farming with his father.
Okay. Were you in Norfolk, Virginia?
We were in Norfolk most of the time, and then when he got out of the Navy, we stayed there. And I was working for the Norfolk Virginian Pilot, and he was working for the Newport News Ledger Star, or no, I'm sorry, the Newport News Times Herald.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And how long were you in Virginia, you said?
We were there 10 years.
10 years. Okay.
Hmm.
Yeah. Well, I'm in Richmond, and I don't know much about Norfolk, but obviously the Navy bases are there and
Right.
big military presence and
Yeah,
everything.
we saw a lot of the Navy base.
Yeah, I bet. And it's kind of a weird area too, just like with Virginia Beach and Norfolk and Chesapeake, they all kind of blend together.
Right, they do.
Huge
They do.
big city. So when did you were working as a journalist? You said you worked at the newspaper. When
Hmm.
did the PhD come in?
Well, I had a Bachelor of Journalism degree, and when we decided to move to Arkansas, there was a position open in public relations at Arkansas State University. So
Okay.
I took that job, and I felt that if I was going to be in higher education, I really needed a higher degree. So I got a master's degree in political science while I was working at Arkansas State. And then not long after I became, well, I guess at about the same time I became vice president for institutional advancement, I had started commuting to Ole Miss in Oxford, Mississippi to work on a PhD in higher education administration. So I got that in 1988.
Okay. So it wasn't history, it was an education.
No, it wasn't history at all. When I first came to Arkansas State, I really wasn't interested in history other than a passing interest. We had lived in Virginia, of course, near Williamsburg, and we were right in the cradle of colonial history. So I was fascinated by all that. But then after I came to Arkansas State University, um, the around the early 90s, the Congress established the Lower Mississippi River. Let's see, the Lower Mississippi Delta Development Commission. Had to pull that out of the past. Um, and there were a lot when they issued their report. There were a lot of materials in there about what needed to be done to improve the plight of the Delta because it was very poor economically. But it was very clear from that report that it had a very rich heritage. And at the time, I was working as vice president for institutional advancement. And so one of the things I started doing was trying to match up some of the needs identified in that report with some of the classes and programs and student projects on campus.
Okay.
And one of those areas was heritage tourism. And that's the piece I really got the most involved with because I was very, very fascinated by the history of the Delta,
Yeah.
very rich history. Um, and we had the opportunity to acquire the home in Piggott, the home in the Barn Studio in Piggott that had been associated with Ernest Hemingway. And we began to work on researching that house and researching the history of the people that lived there and basically developing it as a tourism attraction, but also as a laboratory for our students.
Yeah.
And I just found that very fascinating. I fell in love with history. I fell in love with research. And at that point, and when we completed that project, we were getting a lot of interest from around the state, from other people who wanted us to look at their projects. And so we wound up separating the heritage projects from the institutional advancement office, which I had been heading, and we created what we called then the Delta Heritage Initiatives, which is now Arkansas State University Heritage Sites. So I was there with that project from '99 when we started it to when I retired.
Okay. Let me just back up a little bit. What was your dissertation about at Ole Miss?
Nothing to do with history.
But
and
education.
and you got to bear in mind that it was before the internet, so things
Yeah.
changed significantly. But my dissertation had to do with admission and the kinds of materials that institutions use to recruit students and how effective they were, and the measures of success.
Okay.
Um,
And how long were you in Oxford?
well, I was working full time as vice president for institutional advancement. So I commuted down there on weekends. I would take off at noon on Friday and drive down there and take classes Friday night and all day Saturday and drive back Sunday. And I did that from, let's see, my son was born in 1983. So I started in 1984 when he was about 6 months old. And I got my doctorate in 1988. So
Okay.
years.
Well, that's a pretty good pay. So you're driving down from Jonesboro?
From Jonesboro, yes.
How long is that for a drive?
It was about a 2 hour drive.
Okay.
But then there was one semester when I had to go all the way to Jackson, Mississippi, um, to take a class, and that was more like a 4.5 or 5 hour drive.
Oh, wow. Well, and you said Saturday classes. I didn't even know that was a thing.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And that was just strictly in the higher education program because they recognized that so many people in that program were principals and superintendents and people that were in various administrative areas. And so it worked better for them, to do a full week at school and then come down on the weekends.
Yeah. So you said this is you have a full-time job, you're doing a PhD, and you're having kids.
Right. I'm not I'm not really sure looking back how I did it. And I would
Yeah.
never want to do it again.
Yeah, well, that I think that is true for a lot of people doing a PhD, but especially if you're starting a
Right.
family during I mean, I can't even imagine. I mean,
Right.
I didn't have kids till much later, so
Yeah. It was tough.
wow. Yeah, and so it obviously wasn't your typical kind of undergrad experience. I mean, you were a grad student, but, like, you weren't in Oxford a lot except for classes, or did you
No,
like Oxford when you were there?
I loved Oxford, but
Yeah,
I really didn't identify with it all that much because there usually weren't people there on Saturdays other than people that were sitting in class, but it's a beautiful place and I love being there. And several other people from Arkansas State University were also commuting to work on their doctorates, and we usually stayed in the graduate dorm. So that was interesting, staying in a dorm.
yeah. So you'd stay over, like, one night and then drive back? Or
Well, it sometimes one night, sometimes two, depending on how tired we were when we got out of class on Saturday night.
okay. Yeah, I don't think I've talked to anyone that had a long commute PhD and finished. I think there were some people I knew at LSU that were kinda I don't know if this was your experience too, but, like, people just sort of disappear. Like, a guy would be in the program for a couple
Oh yeah,
years,
and
and then
whatever happened, yeah,
you get
yeah,
a job teaching or whatever, and then that was the end of it. So, like, someone would say, "Well, he got a job up in Alexandria." I'm like, "Well, he's not coming back to Baton Rouge very much
no,
then."
no.
So
Well,
that's
and
impressive.
the other complicating factor was this was at a time when we didn't have internet or computers. We had to type everything,
Right.
and which was a real ordeal typing a dissertation.
Oh, yeah. You didn't pay somebody to do it?
No, I paid somebody to do the illustrations and, the
Okay.
charts and graphs and that kind of thing. But the
Yeah,
rest of it I typed.
okay. Well, and I think it's usually one of those things anyway, even back then, probably I would have been the person that didn't have any money to pay someone to type. I would have just ended up typing it myself and then, went horrible
Yeah.
somewhere or whatever. But you said your husband had moved back to Arkansas to work on a farm. Did that pan
Yes.
out? Did that pan out?
Well, my husband grew up on a farm working with his father. And after we'd been in Virginia 10 years, his dad wanted him to come back and help him with farming. And this was like 1978, 79. And so he and I made a pact that he would come out here during the harvest season and help his father, and I would stay in Virginia at the Newport News schools where I was PR director. And if after 6 months he liked it, then I would move to Arkansas or to Missouri. He was farming in Missouri. He was living in Arkansas. Um, so sure enough, 6 months after he was here, he called and he said, "Well, you better give him your notice and start packing your stuff because it looks like we're going to be staying." So I came out and it was great for a couple of years. But then I don't know if people remember, but in 1980, the bottom kind of fell out of farming. There was a huge drought and everybody went broke. And so he started helping his father with the financial aspects of it, with trying to keep his father afloat and setting up a management system that was so successful that other farmers started asking him to help them. And he wound up getting into financial planning and accounting, which is where he stayed until he retired.
Okay. And so was he working on big farms?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. His father farmed probably about 600 acres. And then, a lot of people around there also rented a lot of land. And he and his father also did custom work, cotton picking and so forth, down on the Texas Mexico border.
Okay. So the area that you're from in Missouri, is it kind of like Arkansas? Does it kind of look the same as the Delta
Um,
or not so
well, it
much?
doesn't look like the Delta because the Delta is obviously very flat,
Okay. Okay.
which I love. But where I grew up, it was actually, our farm was up on a bluff. If we stood on the bluff, we could see where the Missouri River ran into the Mississippi River.
Okay.
So we were right there in North St. Louis County at the confluence of both rivers. And
Yeah.
so yeah, it was a lot different. Uh,
Yeah.
and
Well,
we, along with crops like cotton and, I mean, not cotton, excuse me, we didn't raise cotton, corn and wheat. We also raised hogs and cattle, and nobody in the Delta Boot Heel does that. So
okay. Well, it's a big family. You had like a small army of
we did. It took the
indentured
12
servants.
kids to run the place.
Wow. So how did you kind of feel about that lifestyle growing up? Were you like, I can't wait to get out of here? Or were you okay with it? Or like, what were your feelings about farming generally?
Um, I wouldn't say that I disliked it growing up. I was pretty happy to get away and try something new, but I wouldn't have traded that experience for anything because it really did teach the value of hard work and of sharing and teamwork, that sort of
Yeah.
thing. So
Yeah. Well, you've definitely been a hard worker. And so I'm guessing you had a background in administration essentially. I'm
mhm,
guessing that helped you when you got to Arkansas State. I mean,
right,
not because a lot of historians, I think they have this problem or issue like, well, I want to do history. I don't want to run a department or run, administrative things.
right.
Just want to do my thing. But what I mean, you had a lot of projects going with the heritage studies and everything. Was so you had that experience before you got there, or was there still a lot of learning on the fly once you got involved?
Well, I obviously had a lot of administrative experience in the 10 years that I was with the newspaper and then public relations director. And in Virginia, that was a time when they were going through court ordered desegregation. So, I had experience in writing up desegregation plans and working with the governor and the legislature and that kind of thing. And when I came to Arkansas State, I was never in any teaching role until we established the Ph.D. program in 2001. And then I did teach courses in that were related to what I was doing, like uh, practical problems at heritage sites and heritage tourism and those kinds of classes. But I would say that everything that I have done has been new and different, and they were all a learning experience in one way or another. Because I started out when I came there, I was affirmative action director for a while, I was acting personnel director for a while, I was assistant to the president and acting personnel director, and then, of course, development and public relations and alumni relations were all a part of institutional advancement. And then I really did not know that much about hands on preservation work until we started these projects. And so I really kind of learned all that on the fly.
Yeah, and the first one was the house at Piggott, the
First one was at Piggott, right?
okay, and was that in pretty good shape, like,
Um,
structurally or not s yeah,
Structurally, it was in pretty good shape. The person, it was owned by two different people. The house was owned by one person, and the barn was owned by her son, and he had renovated it into an apartment. So for the barn, there was a lot of tearing off the siding that he had put on, tearing off the rooms that he had added, and basically taking it back to the way it was. And the house, we were also very fortunate that only three families had owned it. Buck Templeton built that house in 1911, I believe, but then the Pfeiffer family moved there from St. Louis in 1913 and talked him into selling it to them. And so they were there from 1913 when they moved to Piggott until Mary Pfeiffer died in 1950. And then they sold it to the James family, and we bought it from the James family. And so the James family, the only real changes they had made, they had completely remodeled the kitchen to make it more a modern 1950s style kitchen, with the metal cabinets and the
yeah,
sinks under the double windows and that kind of thing. So we had to take all that back to the way it was. And of
okay.
course, we had to completely redo plumbing and heating and electrical and all that. There were a number of layers of roofing on it that had to be pulled off. But I guess we were really very fortunate in that the one we started with was in fairly good shape.
Yeah. Now, kind of what was their thinking behind selling to ASU? I mean, did they make the first move or was AS like
Oh, no.
okay.
No, it was a long ordeal
Okay.
because one of the things I talked about the Lower Mississippi Delta Development Commission report, and one of the things they talked about was creating byways that would link attractions and heritage sites together. And so my department began working on developing Crowley's Ridge as Arkansas's first national scenic byway. And the ridge it's a unique landform that was established, that really was created during the ice age, and it's an erosional remnant that juts up from the otherwise flat areas around it. And it goes from basically Clay County and Piggott all the way down to Phillips County and Helena. And we had attractions at the bottom end with the Delta Cultural Center. There were 4 state parks on the ridge. There was a national forest on the ridge. There was Arkansas State University in the middle. But when you got up to Piggott, there wasn't really anything there. And I sort of remembered that Hemingway had ties to Piggott from my high school and college days. I remembered that the Pfeiffers had fixed up a barn to give him privacy for writing, and it was in this barn that he had written portions of A Farewell to Arms. And so I sent a photographer up there, and I said, look, I don't know if anything is up there or not, but check with the locals and see if that house still exists that the Pfeiffers lived in, or if the barn still exists. And he came back and he said, well, not only do they still exist, but the house is for sale. So it turns out that the woman that owned the house had moved to North Carolina to live with her mother. But of course, we didn't want the house without the barn, which was owned by the son. And he absolutely refused to sell on a number of occasions. I mean, it would be a whole story, all of the trips
Sure.
I
Yeah.
made to visit him. But he finally agreed to sell it to us as a charitable gift annuity, whereby he would give us the house and then we would pay him an annual gift annuity for 10 years. Plus, there was another house on the property that we were getting ready to tear down, but we told him that he could live in that house and kind of serve as our caretaker until we got ready, uh, to tear the house down and move on with the project. And so he finally agreed, but it was an ordeal.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, I have not been to Piggott. Does it look kind of like Dias, like it's just sort of flat and treeless and there's
No,
no.
um, Piggott is very much different from Dice because it is right on top of Crowley's Ridge, which is this landform that I
Okay.
mentioned. And
Okay.
you have the flat delta, and then you have this landform that rises about 150 feet out of the delta surrounding it. And it's hilly, and it has what they called loess soil, which was soil blown down during the ice age and piled on top of the ridge. And
Okay.
so it is very, very different soil.
Well, one thing I learned about Arkansas is just how varied the geography is. I mean, like,
Absolutely.
driving from Memphis to Little Rock, it's like flat, 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 and then you hit Little Rock, it's like this fortress on a hill. It's just
Right.
quite steep. But it sounds like, I mean, I don't know, was there a certain pattern with getting these historic properties? Like they kind of didn't want to sell. I know that, yeah, I mean, you could write a whole book about Piggott, and I'm sure the
Mhm.
Johnny Cash house too. But like, was there reluctance kind of at every step of the way with these houses, or were some
Uh,
easier to obtain?
no, they actually all varied significantly. The next project that we did was the Southern Tenant Farmers Museum, which was the property in Tyronza, Arkansas, where uh, Clay East and H.L. Mitchell had a service station and a dry cleaner. And they were socialist. And during the Depression, a lot of tenant farmers were being evicted from their land. And so these farmers started coming to these two men because they were socialist, and they were concerned about the welfare of the common man, and they talked to them. And the two men, along with Norman Thomas, the socialist candidate for president, they all formed a union in 1934. It was the first union in the country that had both black and white farmers in the same union. And it also had women in the union, which, I mean, this was in the 1930s. You can imagine how unusual that was. And so the town really didn't know the significance of the headquarters for the union for a while was in this gas station and dry cleaners building that the two men owned. But after about a year or so, they moved it to Memphis because of the threats they were getting. People were throwing rocks through the windows and shooting at them and that kind of thing. And so they moved it, and it got kind of swept under the rug, and nobody talked about it in Tyronza. The tenant farmers feared retaliation, and the landowners didn't want to talk about it because it was something that was a very unpleasant time. Um, and then one day, a PBS truck was going down the main street of town, and some of the people in town said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "Well, we're filming that 1930s series that PBS did, and this is where the Southern Tenant Farmers Union was started, and the people didn't even know it. So they contacted Arkansas State and they said, "Can you help us preserve this?" And so
Okay.
that's how that one came about. And then Lakeport came about because it was about to fall apart. It was really beginning to deteriorate, and it was in private ownership, and the state was very concerned about saving it. So they put together um, a committee and funded a committee to look at the feasibility of doing something with it. And that feasibility study came to the conclusion that the only way to save it was to put it in private hands. And so the owners were given some options, and they opted to give it to Arkansas State University because they had seen what we had done at other sites.
Yeah.
And then,
Um,
of course, the big one was the Johnny Cash Boyhood Home. And that's one that we didn't actively pursue, although I was always concerned when I drove past that house because it was, as you know, it was falling into the
yeah.
mud. It was awful, and people would drive by there and think that that's the house that Johnny Cash lived in. Well, he didn't live in that house. He lived in a brand new house that was, provided by the government. It wasn't a house that was
Yeah.
sinking into the ground, and I always thought somebody should preserve it. And then a couple of people here in Arkansas with the Arkansas Electric Cooperatives, Carmi Henry and Kirkley Thomas, came to us one day and said, "You all need to do something with that." And they got their legislator involved, and the legislator passed some legislation to do a feasibility study, and the rest is kind of history.
Yeah. Well, and for people who don't know, Lakeport it's right on the Mississippi. It's the only surviving Arkansas plantation home on the Mississippi. Is that
Right, right.
and that was the first one I went to of these properties, and what I thought was very interesting was that you didn't stuff it full of antebellum or late Victorian furniture. You just left it open.
Right.
Whose
Well,
decision was that?
Well, it's very interesting because we put together a statewide preservation restoration committee that had people from all over the state. It had Skip Stewart Abernathy from the Archaeological Survey, and Charles Witzel was the architect, and Becky Witzel, the historic finish specialist, and Tom DeBlack at Arkansas Tech was a historian, and Claudia Shannon was a restoration expert. Excuse me, expert. But we had all these people with all this expertise, and we had a total difference of opinion of what it should be. We had some people on one end of the spectrum that thought we should leave it totally empty and let the house speak for itself. And then we had people at the other end of the spectrum who wanted more of a moonlight and magnolias type interpretation with the house furnished, as you say, and the mint juleps on the porch, and a very romanticized view, which probably never was.
Right, right.
Um, and so, what we decided to do when we opened that house, when we got the restoration part finished, we purposely opened it without any exhibits in it. And then we watched and recorded what people were interested in over the first 5 years that we were open. When people walked through the house, we would record what kind of questions they asked, what they wanted to know about the house, and then we developed an interpretive plan to answer those questions.
Okay.
So the interpretive plan, we said we didn't want anything on the walls. We didn't want anything interfering with the architecture of the house. And the interpretive company that we worked with just did a fabulous job of not interfering at all with the architecture.
Yeah, it was impressive. I did like that it was open, and partly that was a practical decision based on there's really not a lot of documentation for the house, correct?
Well,
In
we
terms
didn't
of
find a lot of papers, business papers. We didn't find a lot of letters. We found some. We
yeah,
didn't even find a lot of photographs.
right,
So what we did find was more evidence of the workman, like, when we would take the mantles out to restore them on the back of the mantle, the mantle maker had carved his name, and the person that made the floor cloth had written LL Lycurgus Johnson, Lakeport Plantation. And, so we found evidence of the various workers on the project. And so we, in all of our projects, we do not do anything unless we can prove it through three different sources.
Okay.
Like on the Hemingway-Pfeiffer project, for instance, the colors that we painted it, we talked to the housekeepers that had been there at the time. We sent them off for paint analysis, and we used physical observation when we took some of the radiators out and looked behind them. And we did the same thing at Lakeport Plantation. We found some original paint on the outside of the house that had been hidden by the addition of a bell system. We sent it off for paint analysis. We did all sorts of things to make sure that we had the right colors in that house. And so everything uh, we did with an understanding of how it was. And if we couldn't document it, we didn't do it.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. How long had it been unoccupied before you took charge?
Um, I have to remember that. It seems like it was in the late 70s, early 80s.
Okay.
Um, Somewhere
So
around that time. I don't really remember exactly.
okay. So about 30 years or so,
Yeah, there
maybe?
had been some work done on it in the early 80s. It was empty then. The Arkansas Historic Preservation Program had a grant program that did some work to repaint it and do some other work with patching places. But in many ways, that grant did more harm than good because the painters use sandblasting, which you don't use on a historic structure, and they did, and they took the huge shutters. I mean, the windows are taller; they're like 8 feet tall, and had these 8 foot tall shutters, and they took the shutters off in order to store them for safekeeping, and they all disappeared at some point, except for one or two. So we had to rebuild those, but fortunately we had a few of the originals so that we had a pattern.
Okay. Yeah, I knew Becky Witzel a little bit when I was in Little Rock,
Right,
and
she was fabulous.
yeah, I remember it was an image of her like stripping the paint off a door or something with
Yeah, she
Q-tips.
Q-tips, and she would have a pile 6 feet tall of Q-tips
Oh
because
my
every
god.
door in the house was painted, but underneath the originals had a faux finish on them to look like cherry wood or oak or whatever. And so she wanted to get that outer paint off, but didn't want to disturb the original paint underneath. And so she had to use Q-tips on these 8 foot doors, or maybe taller than that. I don't remember. They may have been 10 foot, I guess. But
Yeah.
she had to use Q-tips to get all of that off.
Yeah, that's the definition of painstaking, I think.
Yeah, no kidding. I
And
couldn't do it.
no, I couldn't either. So the original color is yellow? Is
Yes,
that
it's kind
yeah,
of that mustardy gold. And I
yeah.
remember I remember the first day we saw it after it was painted, Becky said, "Well, what do you think of the color?" And I said, "Well, I really like it." And she said, "Well, it's a good thing you do because that's the original color and that's what it's got to be." I said, "Okay, well, I'm glad I like it."
Yeah, well, it's yeah, no, it's really a stunning spot, and when I was there, at least I think I went there twice, but at least one time there was cotton all around it. Like, is
Yes.
that a local farmer who just sort of plants on the property, or, like, who's in charge of the cotton there?
Well, the all of the farm around it is still owned by the Angel family that
Okay.
donated the property to us, and of course they have renters who farm it. Um, and it really does add to the ambiance of the property with the cotton still growing all the way around it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I had never seen cotton fields until I moved to
Oh,
Arkansas.
really?
and you're pretty close to Louisiana down there at
Yes.
Lakeport. So you're definitely in the thick of the cotton country. But yeah, it's an amazing job you did there. Now, why did you want to write about the Pfeiffer-Hemingway marriage?
I didn't want to write about it. I felt
Okay.
like I'd already had a journalism career and I had no intention of writing. But as we did the research that was necessary for the restoration of the house and understanding the people that lived in it and how they lived and so forth, it became very clear to me that the way Pauline was treated in most literature, either the contributions of the Pfeiffer family were not mentioned at all, or what was said about Pauline and the Pfeiffer family was not always correct. And that's partly because most of what people knew about Pauline Pfeiffer, they knew from Ernest Hemingway and what he said after they were divorced. And of course, she was not his favorite person after the divorce.
Right.
Um, so he did say negative things about her. And then the other problem is that the Pfeiffer family themselves were very private. They didn't boast about what they did or their works or so forth. And so I was uncovering a lot of material about the Pfeiffers, including lots of letters back and forth between the Pfeiffers and Ernest Hemingway, and between Virginia, her sister, and Pauline herself, and Ernest, and and they were all over the country. I found some at the Stanford University Library, some at the John F. Kennedy Library. But I thought, you know what, somebody has to write a book to set the record straight on the Pfeiffers and just what a major contribution they made to Hemingway's success as a writer. And I thought, well, nobody knows more about that than me. So I felt like I was really compelled to write it.
Now, when were they married? What time period exactly?
They married in 1927 in Paris.
Okay.
They came back to the Key West area in 1928 when Pauline was pregnant with their first child. He had another child by his first wife, and she went to Kansas City and had the baby. But then they came back to Piggott while she recuperated, um, and they were married until 1940 when he divorced her to marry Martha Gellhorn. But during that time, between when they came back to the United States in 1928 and when he divorced her, they were back and forth to Piggott a lot. I mean, their typical pattern was to be in Key West until it turned really hot, and then they would head west to Wyoming and Montana, stopping in Piggott along the way. And sometimes for a month at a time, sometimes a few days at a time, but they would stop in Piggott and he would do some writing there, and they would usually leave the children there and then go on out west and pick up the children when they came back through.
Okay. So the Pfeiffers had money as a family?
Yes, the Pfeiffers had a lot of money, which many people think that that's the reason why Ernest was interested in Pauline, because of her money.
Yeah.
But the Pfeiffers, the entire Pfeiffer family, Paul Pfeiffer, her father, was in the pharmaceutical business first, along with, there were 10 children in the family, and they were all pretty much in the drugstore business and the pharmaceutical business. And one of the brothers moved to St. Louis and established Pfeiffer Chemical Company, and talked Gus Pfeiffer and Paul Pfeiffer into moving to St. Louis with him to get this company up and going. And so they moved there the year that Pauline started first grade. And then that Pfeiffer Pharmaceutical Company merged with the Richard Hudnut Company in well, actually, they merged with the Warner Company in Philadelphia, and then the Richard Hudnut Company in New York. They became Warner Hudnut, and then they became Warner Lambert, and eventually they were bought out by Pfizer. So they had plants they had plants around the world. But what happened was when Gus and his brother moved to New York with the growing company. Paul didn't want to move to New York because he had problems with asthma, and he had started up buying land around the Piggott area. So he moved his family to Piggott the year that Pauline graduated from high school.
Okay. Thinking what was there in Piggott for him? Was it a health thing?
No, well, partly because his asthma was not a problem, but what happened was, the railroads came through that area of Northeast Arkansas in the late 1800s, 1870, 1880, around there,
Yeah.
turn of the century. And most of the railroads were headquartered in St. Louis that came through that area. And when Paul was working in St. Louis, these railroad men would come back and they would say, if somebody was enterprising enough to blast out all of those stumps left by, they were harvesting timber. The reason they put the railroads in is they were harvesting timber and carrying it to the plants in the north. So they were leaving these stumps. And somebody told Paul, if somebody was enterprising, they could blast out all those stumps, and the land under it is really fertile if somebody could figure out how to drain it, and you could really, make a killing from agriculture. And so that's what Paul did. He started buying up land, and in fact, they called it Pfeiffering the land, which was clearing out the
Okay.
stumps and digging drainage ditches to clear it, and
Yeah.
planting cotton,
Wow.
and started hiring some of the best tenant farmers in the country. He wound up owning 63,000 acres of land in Northeast Arkansas, and was really an important person in his own right, even without a son-in-law named Ernest Hemingway. We
Well,
get people to Piggott and we tell they come because of Ernest Hemingway, but they leave. We want to make sure they know all about Paul Pfeiffer and what an enterprising man he was for his time.
yeah. Well, that's such a classic American story, like
Yes.
if someone can figure out how to blow up the stumps, he's like,
Yeah.
I'll do it.
Right.
And
Yeah.
he's got
Right.
all that stump money
Right.
to build on. But she was named after her father, obviously,
Right.
Pauline.
Right.
And what was she like? I know Hemingway was married, what, 4 or 5 times? I can't
He was
remember.
married 4 times. Right.
Four
She was
times.
his second wife.
So how did she sort of differ from the others? And
Well, she was like some and different from some in a way. She, first of all, she had an excellent sense of humor. She was a much better editor than any of the others. I mean, that was her real strength that I think drew Hemingway to her. She had graduated from the University of Missouri School of Journalism in 1918, and was one of the first classes to graduate from that journalism school, and she had worked at in New York at the I forget, she worked in Cleveland first as an editor, and then she worked in New York, and then she worked for Vanity Fair and Vogue, and then Vogue sent her to Paris where she met Ernest Hemingway. So he quickly realized what a great editor she was, and in fact, even after they divorced, he still thought of her as the best editor. And when he was writing For Whom the Bell Tolls, he said, I really wish Pauline would read this now, but she hates me so much she won't even talk to me, much less read my manuscript.
so was there
But,
some competition there, like
well,
as
there was,
writers?
because
Yeah.
he was married to his first wife, Hadley, when Pauline first went to Paris, and she got acquainted with them because of Hadley, because Pauline and Hadley were both from St. Louis. But the more time she spent around them, and the more time she spent with Ernest, with helping him with his editing, they became very close, and he wound up um, divorcing Hadley. And then in 1937, he met Martha Gellhorn. It was 3 years before that he would actually divorce Pauline, but he became involved with Martha Gellhorn, and she was a feisty journalist in her own right, and a very independent woman. And he wound up marrying Martha and basically said to Pauline, well, you got what you deserved. You took me away from Hadley, and now Martha's taking me away from you. Like he had nothing to do with it. Uh, it's pretty
Yeah,
vain, pretty
yeah,
vain. But
uh,
at
yeah,
any rate, that marriage only lasted for less than 5 years, and most of the time they weren't even together because they were really competitors. She was a war correspondent, and they kind of fought for the same assignments, and so then he wound up marrying his last wife, Mary. God, I'm drawing a blank at her name, but Mary was also a journalist, and he had met her during World War II. So really, they were all a little bit different. Pauline made a big mistake in that she really formed herself around him. She could have been a great writer in her own right. Because she was a graduate of the University of Missouri School of Journalism. She wrote for Vogue and Vanity Fair. But when she married him, she pretty much devoted her life to helping him become successful. And not just in editing, but in, keeping the household maintained and keeping the kids quiet and doing all the planning for where they were going and, making sure that they had the funds and all that. She took care of all
yeah,
that so that Hemingway could concentrate on writing.
yeah. Well,
Mary
I guess
Welch, I couldn't think of her name. Mary Welch was his fourth wife.
okay. Well, I guess this is kind of like the peak Hemingway period, right? Like 27 to 1940. I think that's
Yes,
when
she
he's
was,
writing his best stuff.
and that's the thing, and that's why it was so strange that there hadn't been a book about her, because Pauline was married to him during his most productive years as a writer, and she was the mother of two of his three sons. Yet she had the misfortune of dying before Hemingway and before any of his other wives, and so the only things people knew about her were what Hemingway said about her.
Okay. Yeah, I don't remember all the details of the marriage because again, there's so many when watching the documentary that Ken Burns did. Did you see it? The documentary?
I did.
Did you like it?
Yeah, I thought Ken Burns did a phenomenal job of conveying a very complex person. I mean, it
Yeah.
had to be a real feat to determine, what interviews do you use, what clips do you use, what photos do you use. And I thought he did a remarkable job of that. I did think that he did a good job of conveying how important Pauline was as his editor, but I don't think he dispelled any of the stories about her chasing after him and being a manhunter and taking him away from Hadley, his first wife. That's what a lot of people think, and I don't think that at all.
Yeah. No, did she have Pauline, did she have papers at University of Missouri? Is there anything there on her? Or
No, I
no.
mean, there's a few things, like
Okay.
her regular records, her report, her grades, and her memberships and things. But her papers, I mentioned that the Pfeiffers were very private people.
Yeah.
And when she died, she instructed her executor to burn all the papers that were in her desk, including letters from Ernest Hemingway.
I don't know. And did that happen?
Yes, it did,
Okay.
unfortunately.
I always cringe when I hear sometimes it doesn't happen. You hear these
Yeah,
stories of you're supposed to
yeah,
burn it.
yeah. I mean, a
But
lot of them you can still find because Hemingway kept his letters from her, and there's tons of those, but the other way around, there's not that many of his letters to her.
okay.
It's hers to him.
Okay. And so the Key West house was really the Pfeiffer's house that Hemingway kind of adopted. Is that right?
No,
No.
the Key West house was one when they decided in um, actually right before their second child was born in 1931. They had been going back and forth between Piggott and Paris and Key West. And when the second child came along, they decided they probably needed to settle down somewhere. And Pauline found this house in Key West that was in very bad shape, and she talked her Uncle Gus into buying it for them, and then she renovated it. But
Okay.
that was pretty typical. I mean, Uncle Gus, people don't realize just how important he was to Ernest Hemingway and his success as a writer, because Ernest was the beneficiary of $25,000 from Uncle Gus in the 1930s to go to Africa for his safari, which led to green hills of Africa and hills like white elephants and snows of Kilimanjaro. Uh, all those books. But he bought their house for them. Like I say, he paid for their safari. He bought all their cars for them, bought their swimming pool. Whatever they wanted, Uncle Gus usually provided.
Okay. But it was not Hemingway. Like Hemingway didn't take royalties and buy the house with it or anything. It was
No, that
yeah.
was from Uncle Gus.
Okay.
Yeah,
Everybody needs an Uncle Gus. I wish
I
I had
know,
one.
I know.
Um, and so you said you kind of took it on reluctantly. Did you enjoy writing the book at the end, or was
I
it?
did. It
Yeah.
took me a long time though, because I guess I started collecting the material for it when we started restoring the house, which was in 1996, and the book wasn't actually published until 2012. Because in order to write a book like that, I mean, it's chronological, it's a biography of sorts, and in order to write it, I really had to have concentrated blocks of time. And I was, of course, working on all these other projects as well, the Lakeport plantation and Southern Dennet and so forth. And so I would usually take off between Thanksgiving and New Year's. And then that way I would have a block of time that was partial holiday pay and partial vacation. And I would use that block of time, to concentrate on writing the book. Because, if I would find myself, if I was writing about 1923, I'd take time off to go to the grocery store. I'd find myself writing a check for the groceries saying 1923, because you really had to get in
Yeah.
that headspace in order to
Right.
do it. Um,
Yeah.
but I'm glad that it took me as long as I did, and you've probably discovered this as well. But um, you know, you're constantly finding new things, and every time I would find something new, I'd think, oh, I'm glad I haven't published that book before yet, because I need to include
Right.
this. And I mean, that continued right up to the day that I published the book. I even called back the galley proofs at one point to add something that came to me in the mail from the doctor, the family of the doctor who had delivered Pauline's children, and I felt like that belonged in the book. And then after the book was published, several more people sent me letters that, they say, I understand you've written about Pauline Hemingway and thought you might be interested in these letters from her that we've got, so
Yeah.
so it
Yeah.
never ends, really.
Yeah. And I guess you have to. There are some things where, yeah, at the last minute, you're like, well, I really got to put this in or change or whatever. But you also
Right,
have to fight against that urge to just
right,
keep working
right,
on it forever.
right,
Because
right.
what did it take? Like 10 years?
Yeah, really, it was
Yeah.
about 10 years.
Yeah, I know it can very easily happen. Have you thought about writing another book, or are you writing another book?
Absolutely not. People ask me
Okay.
that, and I say, I didn't plan to write the first one, but I certainly don't plan to write a second one. We, one of the reasons we got into all these heritage sites is we wanted these heritage sites to serve as laboratories for our students. And so we now have a heritage studies Ph.D. program, and students, they work at the sites, they help do the research on the sites, they help with the interpretation, they work in the gift shop, they work on tours, they do all aspects of managing these sites. And we have a number of students, who have picked up the history and heritage that has so fascinated me. And so, like, for instance, in Piggott, we have a graduate student now who's working on his dissertation, and the dissertation will be on Pauline Hemingway and her sister Virginia. So people are picking it up, and so I'm really excited that the younger generation is taking over.
Yeah, is there anything quite like this program in terms of, buying, houses that need to be preserved? I mean, I can't think of anything quite like this.
I'm not aware of any. Since we started the program, there are universities that have accepted houses that they've restored for various reasons, like to serve as a hospitality center or, to tie in somehow with the program, but none really where it was so tied in to being a laboratory for a heritage program.
Yeah. Now, and with the Cash House, which is the most recent one that's
Hmm.
finished, correct?
Correct.
You got a lot of, seems like, support and cooperation with the family.
Absolutely.
Um, did they sort of, again, like, did you kind of have to lead with that, or did you maybe find Tommy or Joanne first, and then it kind of snowballed? Like, at what point did they kind of get involved with the house?
Well, they've all been involved since the very beginning. We first got involved with Tommy and Joanne when, again, we had some graduate students who were working with the project, and they were trying to find out what furniture was in the house,
Yeah.
so that we could put it back exactly the way it was. And so they knew that Tommy and Joanne had been born in the house, so they made a trip to Nashville and interviewed them. And from that first interview, they became totally immersed in the project. I mean, um, they would draw pictures of what was in the house. They would find pictures in magazines from the 20s and 30s and 40s and send them to us. They would make trips, maybe every quarter to check our progress and see how we were doing. Uh, Joanne even, sometimes she would just come up on the weekend on a Saturday, and she would sit on the porch swing out on the front porch of the house, and we would bring tours up, and they'd see her sitting there, and she'd say, "Hi, I'm Joanne Cash. I'm Johnny's baby sister, and let me tour you through the house." And she would give the tour.
Wow.
So, so they have been totally involved. Of course, they're both not in the best of health, so they've had to curtail all that. But then we also decided that we wanted to do a Johnny Cash festival of some sorts, or a music concert to raise money for the house. And when Roseanne heard about it, she said, "I want to be a part of that." When we talked to her about it, she absolutely said, "I'm in on this." And she didn't just give lip service to it. I mean, she's helped with hosting the concert. She's helped with putting together the talent. She's helped with structuring it, including the change from a music festival to a heritage festival. She's donated things from her father. Of course, we just gave her an honorary doctorate
Right.
Friday. So,
Yeah, I saw that.
yeah, so it's
Yeah.
well deserved. But she and not just Roseanne, but her three other sisters and her brother John Carter, they just have all been totally involved. Anything that we wanted, they've been right there for us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's been great to see. I mean,
Yeah,
obviously Roseanne, yeah, she's a good person and all, but she does a lot. I mean, it
she
seems like every
does.
time
She
there's
does.
something happening there, she's
Yeah,
there.
and she loves the project. And the reason she loves it so much, and the others too, is that it's not a project that glorifies her father. It
Right.
tells the story of very poor farmers who were resettled during the Great Depression by the federal government in an agricultural resettlement colony as an experiment to get farmers back on their feet. And the Cash family just happened to be one of the 500 families that were recruited to come there. So it doesn't just tell a story about Johnny Cash. It tells a story about all these people who were given a leg up during the Great Depression.
Yeah. Well, and for people that don't know, it's not just the Cash House, it's also the administration building in the center
Right.
of town. It's been revitalized, and the theater and everything. So it's
Right.
kind of a full
Right.
experience you can get.
Yeah, and a lot of people, a lot of former colonists have started giving us papers from that era, and of course, we've done a lot of oral history interviews, and so we have now just opened. I say we, like I'm still there. I'm retired, but it's still I'm still
Sure.
involved.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
we've now opened a research center and are in the process of archiving all of those papers and oral histories and photographs and memorabilia so that it will be open to the general public to come and do research there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. No, I mean it's a fascinating story at a number of levels, even if Johnny Cash had never moved
Right,
up
that's right.
there. So yeah, it's really amazing work that you've done there. Are there any, or you said things are still kind of trickling in terms of like Cash memorabilia or whatever, like
Right,
little bits and pieces? Like I remember you told me about the pillow, Jack's
right.
pillow that it got donated. So that's cool. Are there plans for another property taking hold of
Um,
something?
Not really. Of course, you never
Okay.
know, but we, there it's very difficult now to find any grant funds for restoration projects. And not just that, but even if you can find money for restoration projects, it's very difficult to find the money to sustain those projects. So, what we are doing now, we've made a bit of a shift, and the person who was hired to replace me is a person that's been very involved with the program for a long time. He was the director of the Hemingway-Pfeiffer Museum for a while. And he really is going to be able to, he's very interested in programming and, working with children, working with adults. So he's going to be able to take it to that whole next level. Whereas we were working on writing grants to get funds to restore it and to get it restored and up and running. He's really more working more on the programming aspects of it and really making it available to the general public and to scholars and to students in the area.
Yeah. And so the festival there's one being planned for the fall?
Yes, I don't know what direction that will take at this point. I know that Dr. Long, Adam Long, who replaced me, is working now with the Cash family on exactly what that will look like.
Okay. Yeah, I know it's always an issue. And when you can't get, you just need to get an Uncle Gus, I guess,
That's right.
hopefully.
Uncle, everybody needs an Uncle Gus.
An endowment
Yeah.
from the Pfeiffers or something. Well, Ruth, it's been great talking to you. I'm glad we could do this. And again, just the legacy of this program, what you've done in Arkansas is just amazing to me. And hopefully I can get back there soon and check out one of the properties again, because it really is. I mean, to kind of quote Roseanne and other people, but not just the Cash House, but others too. It is like a time machine.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
so, uh,
Absolutely.
so thank you for all your hard work there,
Well, thank
and
you.
it's nice talking to you. And
It's
I'll have
nice to
this.
talk to you too. And I appreciate being able to talk about these projects.
Sure thing. Should be ready in a couple weeks. I'll let you know.
Okay. Thank
Okay,
you.
thanks a
Bye,
lot, Ruth.
Colin.
Take care. Bye bye.
All right, that was my talk with Ruth Hawkins. I hope you enjoyed that. Once again, her book you can get in paperback is Unbelievable Happiness and Final Sorrow, the Hemingway-Pfeiffer Marriage. Is available for $9.99 on Kindle, and you can get it in paperback for $23.25. As I said, I just ordered my copy. I'm looking forward to reading that. Do have a bit of a stack of books piling up, and one of my best tweets of late was me talking about how does it feel like you're a third of the way through about 10 books, and a lot of people agreed with that. So I didn't feel quite so bad, quite so nerdy. I've been skipping around, sampling different books because I feel like I haven't read anything in a while, which isn't true, but I'm taking a break from heavy duty writing right now, just trying to catch up on my reading. So I got a lot of different things, history, also some fiction, and something will come across my desk, and I'll also be on walks and see something, a little free library, and maybe pick that up. Some Graham Greene I've been into lately. So never a shortage of things to read, but it is time consuming to write a book, time consuming to read it. But I kind of need to fill the tank, so I'm looking forward to getting some reading done this summer. All right. Well, I hope you were doing okay. Once again, my book, Country Boy, The Roots of Johnny Cash, is available for pre-order on Amazon, $24.95, so please check that out. All right, I'll be talking with you soon. Take care. Bye.